Garrison Vance once made a sovereign wealth manager weep in a glass conference room and then dispatched a crystal fruit basket directly to his Mediterranean chalet. That was the first sentence out of my mouth before sunrise, half asleep, barefoot on marble, already brewing dark espresso while managing a delicate international diplomatic fallout between two rival aerospace magnates over a private estate in Aspen that both had mistakenly reserved for the exact same weekend. I was not technically supposed to be handling that emergency call. On paper, I was not even anywhere within their public org chart. But as routinely happened across 18 intense years at Thornton Strategic Partners, someone high enough on the corporate food chain had quietly instructed the managing team to loop in Eleanor Mercer because she knows how to fix catastrophic messes without making a sound. By 6:47 a.m., I had smoothed over the dispute entirely. The European property owner was delivering a rare vintage reserve, and I had quietly neutralized what could have degenerated into a $400 million corporate grudge match with two precise encrypted emails and a 15-second voice memorandum. By 7:03 a.m., I had vanished back into the background. That was my standard rhythm. Corporate executives love to treat senior fixers like exceptionally reliable shadows. Never invited to high-level strategy retreats in Cabo, never mentioned in shiny glossy marketing brochures, yet mysteriously copied on every urgent legal filing and private settlement that could tear the firm apart if exposed to public scrutiny. I never cared for their applause. Let the managing partners enjoy their catered gourmet lunches and fine vintage champagne, while I personally kept our corporate vessel from crashing straight into jagged financial rocks. However, today felt markedly different. Tonight was the mandatory kickoff dinner with the Vance family, the firm's most powerful legacy account. The Vance Global Retainer was a legendary dynasty file that did not merely finance annual executive bonuses. It effectively sustained the firm's entire balance sheet. If a senior partner wished to acquire a coastal mansion in La Jolla or fund a private jet lease, chances were Garrison Vance's quarterly wire transfer covered the foundation. Now, heavy industry whispers confirmed that Garrison Vance, known throughout Wall Street as the Iron Whale, was finally taking a step back into strategic board oversight. In billionaire corporate vernacular, that meant watching intently from a handcrafted mahogany chair while his entitled heir took the wheel, Ente Julian Vance. The name sounded like an overpriced cologne brand or a failed tech startup backed by trust fund equity. Julian possessed a Harvard Business School diploma, flawless veneers, and an established reputation for terminating senior executives mid-sentence purely for athletic sport. The firm had spent 7 grueling months courting his favor, and tonight's private steakhouse dinner was supposed to cement a generational transition of authority. Guess who the senior partners tasked with quietly guiding the entire transition from the background? Not the managing partner whose name occupied the corner office. Not the senior vice president wearing $900 Italian Oxfords and a spray tan ending abruptly at his collar line. They turned directly to me. Just keep the evening running seamlessly, they urged in low, anxious tones. You know how volatile Garrison can be, and Julian is extremely sensitive to deference. Just play nice and keep everyone happy. The subtext was blindingly obvious. Babysit the entitled heir, flatter the old patriarch, and above all else, do not utter a single sentence that might make the partners look unneeded. Do not display superior intelligence. Just nod politely and make sure the wine glasses remain filled. I did not argue. After nearly 2 decades in high-stakes corporate crisis management, I had long since learned that quiet compliance often yields the sharpest tactical advantages. Yet something prickled uncomfortably beneath my skin when I downloaded the final event schedule and noticed my full name listed neatly under support staff. 18 years of hopping on international flights with 48 hours of notice, neutralizing executive scandals, quietly rectifying corporate tax irregularities, and managing complex regulatory filings. I once persuaded an international defense contractor to sign a strict ethics compliance clause without raising his voice. But according to our polished partners, I was merely support staff. Still, I maintained a subtle, unreadable smile because I understood a fundamental law of corporate warfare that they continually overlooked. I had survived at Thornton Strategic Partners for almost 20 years, not by begging for titles or parading down marble hallways, but by mastering the art of indirect authority, influence that operates without needing a brass nameplate, tactical leverage that requires no public spotlight. I am not a brand to be showcased on corporate slides. I am an operational weapon. Tonight, that weapon was being placed directly on the crystal table right beside Julian Vance's bloated, gold-plated ego. Before departing my office, I conducted a meticulous final verification of the seating arrangements, ensured that our PR intern Chloe Reed had her high-resolution recording gear initialized under our official corporate documentation guidelines, and took a calm, measured breath. Under Section 106 of Title 17 of the United States Code, all visual and audio recordings created by company employees within the scope of their employment constitute corporate property held under work-for-hire provisions. Thornton Strategic Partners had no concept of the legal storm about to erupt. Julian Vance was arriving for dinner, and I was fully prepared to serve him a lesson in corporate retribution that no business school curriculum could ever teach. The dry-aged prime cut was impeccable. The vintage red was older than most of our junior associates, and Julian Vance was 43 minutes late. I had just taken my second deliberate sip of vintage wine when the heavy oak doors of the private dining room swung open as though an invisible stage manager had cued his theatrical arrival. Julian strolled into the room, looking like a man who had stepped off a luxury yacht and was not entirely certain if he had bothered to put on socks under his navy loafers. He wore tailored white trousers and a camel hair blazer slung carelessly over his right shoulder. He did not bother making eye contact with me or anyone else present. He merely offered a vague, dismissive wave toward our table and muttered that he had been forced to handle an urgent private equity call out of Geneva. No one questioned the assertion, though everyone present recognized Geneva as corporate code for an extended liquid brunch with hedge fund associates. He took his seat right at the head of the table, the exact seat reserved for his father Garrison, and emitted a sharp, barking laugh when the sommelier offered to present the reserve list. "Let us not pretend anyone in this room possesses a refined palate," Julian announced loudly. The senior partner immediately launched into his practiced monologue of bootlicking subservience. "Julian, it is an absolute honor," he purred, leaning forward with an exaggerated grin. "We are all deeply excited to observe where your modern vision will lead Vance Global. Your father has always been an extraordinary visionary." Julian appeared profoundly unimpressed, resembling a disaffected tech investor auditioning for a minor role in a corporate television drama. He scrolled continuously through his smartphone while our firm's highest-paid minds pitched him as though he were the final arbiter on a venture capital panel. I remained completely silent. I poured sparkling water, smoothed the linen cloth, and observed every subtle shift in the room's dynamic. I observed Garrison Vance's jaw muscle twitch every time his son rudely interrupted a senior partner or mispronounced a key director's surname. Then, midway through the main course, Julian turned his gaze toward me, his lips curving into a patronizing smirk. "So, what exactly is your function here?" he inquired, elevating his tone so that two nearby waiters paused mid-service. Before I could formulate a response, he added sneeringly, "Let me guess, logistics, calendar management, corporate morale? You are the one who ensures the managing partners have fresh mints prior to a pitch, correct?" An awkward chuckle rippled across the table. The managing partner seated to my right turned crimson with embarrassment and attempted to pivot the conversation toward dessert. I maintained a composed, tight-lipped smile. "My primary function," I replied evenly, "is ensuring that no one at this table accidentally forfeits an $85 million legacy account due to hubris." Julian blinked, snorted in disdain, and waved his hand dismissively. "Right. Exceptionally crucial work, I am sure." For the remainder of the dinner, he treated me as though I were completely invisible, which suited my immediate objectives perfectly. But when dessert concluded and coffee was poured, I deliberately stood up from my seat. I extended my right hand across the polished mahogany table toward Julian. "Julian, I do not believe we were formally introduced," I said in a calm, professional tone. "Eleanor Mercer. I have managed the Vance Global portfolio since your father signed his primary retainer 18 years ago. It is a genuine pleasure. Julian glanced down at my extended hand as though it were covered in toxic residue. He leaned back in his leather chair, let out a loud, mocking scoff, and declared for the entire room to hear, "I do not shake hands with support staff." The private dining room froze instantaneously. A waiter stood motionless with a coffee carafe suspended mid-air. The managing partners went deathly quiet. I did not pull my hand back in embarrassment, nor did I flinch. Instead, I withdrew my arm with deliberate grace, as though he had merely handed me a discarded napkin. "Thank you for clarifying your boundaries," I stated calmly. I turned my head slightly, catching the eye of Chloe Reed, our junior PR intern seated 2 chairs down. She gave the subtlest nod imaginable. Her high-definition camera had recorded the entire interaction in crisp, crystal-clear detail under our corporate documentation protocol. The frame was pristine, the audio unblemished, the timestamp logged. I sat back down, smoothed my napkin, and took another calm sip of espresso. I did not retaliate. I did not need to do so. Julian Vance had just declared open war on the most dangerous operative in the firm, and by sunrise, that recording would be sitting directly on the desk of the only man whose opinion he still feared. His father, Garrison Vance. By 7:12 a.m. the following morning, the unedited video file was delivered directly into Garrison Vance's private encrypted inbox. There was no theatrical subject line, no emotional body text, and no commentary attached. I simply dispatched the raw, high-definition digital file. Garrison was a veteran industrial titan who despised being told how to interpret facts. He demanded cold, objective evidence. Once he viewed his only son openly humiliating the senior executive who had protected his corporate assets for nearly 2 decades, he would understand the exact legal and commercial ramifications without a single prompt from me. I did not alter my morning routine in the slightest. I did not pace across my office floor, nor did I vent my frustration to colleagues. That is the amateur approach to corporate conflict. I spent the early morning hours executing my routine responsibilities, resolving a complex cross-border compliance discrepancy, reviewing intellectual property filings, and ensuring that a major European investor's private aircraft was cleared for landing without regulatory delay. Yet by 9:30 a.m., the internal corporate grapevine was already vibrating. Passing by the executive break room, I caught snippets of hushed conversation between 2 junior associates. He claimed she exceeded her authority at dinner, one whispered over coffee. He insists Eleanor was insubordinate and embarrassed the executive team in front of the Vance leadership. He is demanding she be reassigned immediately. I continued walking past without breaking stride, the sharp click of my heels against the marble floor serving as absolute punctuation. At 10:17 a.m., an automated calendar alert flashed across my laptop screen. Removal notice. Vance Global Transition Task Force. Access revoked. 5 minutes later, my corporate credentials were purged from the client communications channels. By 11:03 a.m., my administrative permissions for the primary account database were completely terminated. The executive leadership did not even attempt to mask their actions with polite bureaucratic excuses. There was no mention of a system error or routine realignment. It was a digital door slammed squarely in my face, followed by the immediate drawing of corporate blinds. Julian Vance was merely the sparking match. The senior managing partners were the underlying furnace. They had spent years waiting for a convenient pretext to sideline me, without risking a public wrongful termination lawsuit. They were likely thrilled, believing they had neatly benched an overly knowledgeable fixer who knew far too much about their past mistakes. Yet I remained entirely composed. When the head of corporate communications dispatched a patronizing email reminding staff of organizational hierarchies and operational boundaries, I did not reply. When the senior vice president accidentally sent me an internal message intended for another partner, reading, "Let us keep Eleanor completely isolated from client discussions until this situation cools down," I simply archived the message for my legal counsel. Even when Chloe Reed, the junior intern, entered my office looking visibly terrified and whispered, "Miss Mercer, should I erase the raw dinner footage from the secondary drive?" I looked at her with total calm. "Absolutely not," I instructed her quietly. Create 2 additional encrypted backups and store them off-site under Section 106 Work-for-Hire documentation standards. By noon, Julian Vance was holding court in the Central Executive Lounge, loudly regaling junior partners with his decisive actions regarding staff discipline. As I walked toward the elevators to attend an off-site legal briefing, Julian stepped into the hallway, a smug, arrogant grin plastered across his face. "Enjoy managing routine paperwork, Eleanor," he muttered under his breath as I passed. "Someone has to keep the office coffee machine running." I did not halt my momentum. I did not blink, nor did I allow my facial expression to betray a single emotion. Inside me, a quiet, surgical clarity took hold. It was not emotional rage. Rage is sloppy and unpredictable. This was cold, calculated, strategic alignment. It was the precise state of mind where peripheral noise vanishes and your intellect begins rearranging the corporate chessboard. Positioning pawns, deploying knights, and calculating the exact coordinate where the opponent's king must inevitably fall. Under the restatement, 2nd of Agency Section 387, an agent is bound by a strict fiduciary duty to act solely for the benefit of the principal in all matters connected with his agency. By sabotaging my operational standing to shield his own ego, Julian had committed a blatant breach of fiduciary duty against both the firm and his father's entity. I had provided Garrison Vance with an unvarnished mirror. Now, I merely needed to wait for the iron whale to shatter it directly over his son's arrogant head. When that moment arrived, I would be standing right there, completely invisible, entirely calm, and holding the controlling leverage. At precisely 11:08 a.m., the landline on my desk rang. I maintained a private landline because Garrison Vance refused on principle to utilize text messaging for substantive business communications. However, it was not Garrison on the line. It was our chief of building security, his voice strained with acute anxiety. "Miss Mercer, Garrison Vance has just entered the main lobby," the security director reported breathlessly. "He is demanding immediate, unescorted access to the main boardroom. He has no scheduled appointment on the master calendar." When reception requested verification, he stated, and I quote directly, "Tell them Garrison Vance does not request permission to enter buildings funded by his own capital operations." I stood up, adjusted the lapels of my tailored blazer, and walked calmly toward the glass wall overlooking the central atrium. Garrison Vance was marching across the polished granite floor in a dark charcoal overcoat that resembled military armor more than executive attire. He brought no executive entourage, no junior assistants, and no legal counsel. He carried only a heavy black leather portfolio clutched tightly in his right hand like a loaded judicial weapon. Across the hallway, our primary glass boardroom was hosting a high-stakes corporate restructuring pitch with a major biotechnology conglomerate. Over $350 million in capital allocations hung in the balance. Senior managing partners were presenting polished slide decks, corporate lawyers were hovering with legal disclosures, and executives were visibly sweating under the bright lights. I did not issue a warning. I simply stood by my window and watched as Garrison Vance pushed through the heavy glass doors without knocking. He did not offer a polite greeting. He detonated. "I certainly hope you are not attempting to finalize contractual terms," Garrison announced, his deep, resonant voice slicing through the room like a judicial gavel striking a marble bench. "Because not a single transaction under discussion is going forward." A heavy, suffocating silence gripped the boardroom. The visiting biotechnology chief executive stared in absolute shock, his pen frozen over a document. Managing partner Preston Thornton stood up halfway, then collapsed back into his chair as though his legs had completely given out. Garrison marched directly to the center of the mahogany conference table, unzipped the black leather folder, and deliberately emptied its contents across the glass surface. Glossy, high-resolution photographs, certified audio transcripts, and video stills captured from Chloe Reed's camera spread across the table. There was Julian grinning arrogance, there was my extended hand, and there, rendered in crisp typography, were the exact words. "I do not shake hands with support staff." Garrison did not raise his voice. He did not need to do so. True executive power never requires screaming. "This woman," Garrison said, Pointing a heavy index finger directly at a high-definition photograph of my face is the sole reason Vance Global has maintained an exclusive retainer with this firm for 18 consecutive years. She built your compliance systems. She protected your reputation. She managed my international assets before your current partners even understood basic corporate governance. Then, slowly and with deliberate control, Garrison reached into his coat, pulled out the signed $85 million annual retainer contract that had been finalized earlier that week, and tore it cleanly in half. The sharp sound of ripping parchment echoed through the silent boardroom like a gunshot in a cathedral. "Now," Garrison declared, tossing the shredded contract directly onto the table, "she is the exact reason Vance Global terminates all commercial associations with your enterprise, effective immediately." He turned toward the exit. But just as his hand touched the stainless steel handle, Garrison halted, turned back toward Preston Thornton, and delivered a final, devastating decree. "If your executive board ever attempts to humiliate my primary corporate representative again, ensure that your legal team has prepared for total financial liquidation. Under our master agreement, this contract is declared void ab initio due to bad faith representation. And furthermore, I will only execute future business transactions with this firm if Eleanor Mercer is sitting in the chief executive officer chair." He pulled open the glass door and walked out, his heavy footsteps echoing down the corridor. No one in the boardroom moved. Managing partner Preston Thornton looked as though he were experiencing a severe medical episode. The visiting biotechnology representatives began quietly gathering their leather portfolios in complete embarrassment. Across the hallway, I remained seated at my desk, composed and serene. For 18 years, I had been Thornton's strategic partner's secret weapon. Now, in a single explosive instant, I had become their only path to corporate survival. The internal seismic tremor began almost instantly. At 11:21 a.m., an emergency calendar invitation flooded every senior partner's inbox. Mandatory Executive Crisis Committee. Immediate attendance required. There was no agenda attached, no preliminary brief, and no formal documentation. Just pure, unadulterated executive panic formatted into an Outlook notification. From my office window, I watched the managing partners scurry down the private corridor toward the secondary war room. They did not utilize the primary boardroom. The shredded contract lying across the conference table was far too visceral a reminder of their catastrophic blunder. They lowered the heavy executive blinds, attempting to conceal their internal chaos. I did not attempt to follow them. I sat quietly at my desk, reviewing an international property acquisition filing for a corporate client in Singapore. At 11:46 a.m., muffled shouting spilled into the hallway. Arguments erupted over liability clauses, client retention metrics, and potential lawsuits. At 12:01 p.m., CFO Donald Albright emerged from the war room, his tie loosened, his forehead slick with perspiration. He walked directly into my office, attempting to project a demeanor of calm reconciliation. "Eleanor," Donald began, his voice wavering slightly as he gripped the edge of my desk. Obviously, the events of this morning were highly unorthodox. Garrison Vance expressed his views in an extreme fashion. However, the executive board has met, and we are prepared to offer you an immediate reinstatement to senior client operations, complete with a senior vice president title and a $400,000 retention bonus. I looked at him with absolute calm. Saying nothing, Donald shifted his weight uncomfortably. "Eleanor, please understand, this is an extraordinary opportunity. We want to align your compensation with your actual value to legacy clients. Let us put this unpleasant dinner incident behind us and return to what works. Back to what works, meaning a structure where I continue performing the heavy strategic labor in the shadows while they collect multi-million-dollar profit distributions and pretend I am merely operational support." "I am declining your proposal, Donald," I responded in a calm, measured tone. Donald turned pale. "Eleanor, you cannot simply decline a board reinstatement." "I already have," I stated plainly. By 12:27 p.m., my personal phone vibrated with a message from an unlisted number. It was the managing director of Vanguard Global, our fiercest corporate competitor. "We observed Garrison Vance's departure from your building. Vanguard Global is prepared to offer you a managing partner role and full equity participation today. I took 4 seconds to evaluate the message, then archived it. I did not require an exit strategy. I was preparing to capture the entire fortress. On Thursday evening, managing partner Preston Thornton extended an invitation for a private meeting at his secluded estate in Greenwich. The setting was designed to project historical stability, manicured grounds, antique mahogany furniture, and expensive wine. Seated around the dining table were the core power brokers of the firm. Preston Thornton, CFO Donald Albright, Head of Strategy Gavin Stone, and Legal VP Diana Cross. Preston poured a glass of wine and began in a practiced, persuasive tone. Eleanor, we acknowledge that corporate oversights occurred regarding your position. We are prepared to create an executive committee directorship specifically tailored for your oversight. I opened my leather briefcase, pulled out a bound black ledger, and placed it quietly on the linen tablecloth. Inside that ledger were 12 years of meticulously documented internal violations. Instances where senior partners had appropriated my strategic models, improper handling of client retainer accounts, and severe non-compliance with the Worker Adjustment and Retraining Notification Act under Title 29 of the United States Code, Section 201 regarding secret employee terminations. The room went dead silent. Legal VP Diana Cross stared at the documents, her professional composure vanishing entirely. I am not here to negotiate a vice presidency or request a bonus, I said, looking each partner directly in the eye. You do not require another strategic advisor. You require an absolute purge of toxic governance. Gavin Stone leaned forward, his voice tight. What are you implying, Eleanor? I am not implying anything, I replied surgically. I am dictating terms. You have until 5 p.m. on Friday to execute a complete restructuring. Strip Julian Vance of all advisory access, initiate formal misconduct audits against the partners who facilitated this environment, and appoint me Chief Executive Officer with full administrative authority. I stood up, gathered my ledger, and walked out into the evening air, leaving the firm's leadership paralyzed in their own manufactured crisis. By 9 a.m. on Monday morning, the corporate directory had been completely updated. Julian Vance's name was entirely erased from the system. An official corporate memorandum announced his indefinite departure to pursue personal endeavors, corporate translation for being forcefully removed by his father and stripped of all voting proxies. But Julian was merely the initial casualty. By Tuesday afternoon, 2 senior managing partners who had spent years fostering a retaliatory internal culture voluntarily resigned, citing a desire to focus on private investments. In reality, they had been presented with the evidence in my black ledger and given 48 hours to exit quietly before formal legal proceedings were initiated for breach of fiduciary duty and corporate asset misallocation. On Wednesday, our Human Resources Department issued a sweeping policy revision. All historic non-disclosure agreements masking executive misconduct, retaliatory reassignments, and gender-based compensation disparities were opened for comprehensive legal review. The firm was undergoing a complete, uncompromising systemic cleansing, and I had not raised my voice once. At 3:27 p.m. on Thursday, the executive board convened for an extraordinary session. Managing partner Preston Thornton, looking visibly aged, formally presented the board resolution. The vote was unanimous. Eleanor Mercer was officially appointed Chief Executive Officer of Thornton Strategic Partners, vested with total operational, financial, and managerial authority. I did not celebrate with champagne, nor did I make emotional speeches to the press. I immediately executed Corporate Governance Policy version 2.0, establishing strict whistleblower protections under federal law, mandating quarterly pay equity audits, and tying all executive compensation directly to ethical performance metrics. 3 weeks later, the firm hosted its annual Global Investors Summit in a massive glass auditorium in Manhattan. Hundreds of institutional investors, corporate clients, and industry analysts filled the room. The managing partners had prepared a sleek, conventional slide deck focusing on market expansion and quarterly revenue projections. When I walked onto the main stage in a tailored black suit, the auditorium fell into attentive silence. I held the remote control, stepped past the podium, and looked directly into the audience. We are not going to review standard marketing projections today, I announced clearly. I clicked the control button. The sleek corporate presentation vanished from the massive LED screens behind me. In its place appeared a high-resolution still photograph from the steakhouse dinner. Julian Vance sneering across the table, and my hand extended in professional courtesy. Beneath the photograph, rendered in stark white typography, were the words, "Operational excellence requires absolute respect." This enterprise, I stated, my voice echoing powerfully through the auditorium, was sustained for decades by brilliant individuals working silently in the background while arrogant leadership took the credit. That era is permanently closed. We do not operate at the whim of entitled heirs who inherit authority without earning competence. We operate on integrity, accountability, and unyielding professional standards. The silence in the auditorium was absolute for 3 full seconds. Then, starting with a senior institutional investor in the front row, applause began to build. It grew into a standing ovation that reverberated across the entire hall. Across the front row, the remaining board members clapped slowly, recognizing that the balance of power had permanently shifted. I stepped off the stage with an unyielding spine and a clear vision. The battle was won, the firm was transformed, and the crown was firmly secured.